In the world of crime, there are killers, and then there's Richard Kuklinski, a man who was known as the Iceman, a ruthless hitman who left a trail of bodies across the country. But here's the chilling truth. His most terrifying weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was his cold, ruthless aggression. He claimed to have killed over 100 people. But was he the monster he appeared to be? Or was he simply a product of his dark, twisted upbringing? In this episode, we will unravel the secrets behind the man who became one of the most feared assassins in history. This is Richard Kuklinski's story, and it's colder than you can imagine. But before we dive in, some of the details in this story are disturbing and may not be suitable for all audiences, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. As always, remember to hit the like button, share the video, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to stay up to date with the channel. Alright, let's dive into the video. Richard Kuklinski, born on 1935 in Jersey City, New Jersey, had a childhood that could only be described as horrific. Abuse wasn't just a part of his life, it defined it. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was a violent alcoholic who frequently beat Richard and his siblings without mercy. These weren't occasional outbursts, they were brutal attacks that often left serious injuries. Adding to the torment was his mother, Anna, whose deep religious beliefs didn't translate into compassion. Instead of protecting her children, she added to their misery by physically punishing them and turning a blind eye to her husband's violence. The Kuklinski household was not just dysfunctional, it was a nightmare. One of the most devastating moments of Richard's young life came when his older brother Florian died. The cause? A beating from Stanley that went too far. To avoid the police, the family lied, claiming Florian fell down the stairs. This dark incident stayed with Richard, shaping his understanding of violence as a way to dominate and control. The chaos in Richard's home spilled over into his personality. By the time he was a young boy, he had already started acting out his anger on animals. Neighborhood strays became his first victims, a chilling sign of the darkness growing inside him. At just 14 years old, Richard committed his first murder. After being bullied by a local boy, Richard snapped. He grabbed a wooden rod and beat the boy to death. Then, he disposed of the body to avoid being caught. This act began a long, bloody path that would make him infamous. Years later, psychiatrists studying Richard diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. The signs were clear. He lacked empathy, was deeply paranoid, and couldn't form real connections with others. These traits didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the direct result of a childhood filled with pain and fear. Richard's upbringing forced him to suppress his emotions. He learned to keep his feelings buried deep, wearing a cold and detached mask. This emotional numbness allowed him to commit acts of violence without a flicker of remorse. Stanley's relentless violence taught Richard that fear was power. If you could make someone fear you, you could control them. On the other hand, Anna's passive acceptance of the abuse showed him that love and protection were not guaranteed. These conflicting lessons created a warped sense of morality in Richard. For him, violence wasn't just acceptable, it was essential for survival. Richard also grew up in an atmosphere of constant mistrust. In a home where betrayal was the norm, he learned to be hyper-vigilant. This paranoia became a key part of his personality, shaping the way he interacted with the world. As a teenager, Richard earned a reputation for his violent temper and intimidating presence. His size alone was enough to scare most people, but it was his unpredictable nature that made him truly dangerous. Beneath his tough exterior, however, was a deeply insecure boy struggling with the scars of his past. This mix of aggression and vulnerability made Richard volatile. He was someone you didn't want to cross, not because he was fearless, but because he was unpredictable. By the time Richard reached adulthood, the damage was done. The years of abuse had not just left him with physical scars, they had shaped his worldview. For Richard, power was everything, and violence was the fastest way to get it. These early experiences set the stage for his later career as a feared contract killer. His ability to kill without hesitation or remorse made him a valuable asset to organized crime. The lessons he learned in his childhood about fear, control, and emotional detachment became the foundation of his dark legacy. Richard Kuklinski's childhood was more than just tragic. It was the breeding ground for a monster. The abuse, neglect, and trauma he endured didn't just make him dangerous, they stripped him of his humanity. For Richard, life was a battlefield, and violence was the only language he understood. Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, led a terrifying double life. To the outside world, he was a loving husband and father. But behind closed doors, he was a violent and dangerous man. Richard married Barbara Pedrici in 1961, and together they had 3 children, Merrick, Kristen, and Dwayne. While he provided for his family, his actions were anything but loving. Barbara, who was just 19 when she married him, lived in constant fear. Richard had a short temper and used threats and intimidation to control her. He even went as far as threatening to kill her family if she didn't marry him. This kind of control continued throughout their marriage, with Barbara trapped in a life of fear. Despite his anger and violence at home, Richard kept up appearances in the community. He attended church, hosted family barbecues, and acted like the perfect dad and husband when neighbors were around. Inside the home, Richard's behavior was far from perfect. He never physically harmed his children, but his violent outbursts were terrifying. Barbara recalls times when he broke her nose multiple times, tried to run her over with a car, and even held a pillow over her face during violent threats. One of the most shocking moments was when Richard killed the family dog as punishment for their daughter Merrick breaking curfew. The family never knew the full extent of Richard's criminal life. Barbara thought her husband was just a hard-working man who provided for them. She had no idea that Richard was secretly a hitman for mafia families, and that his wealth came from murder. To the outside world, he was just a regular guy. At home, he was a monster who could flip from affection to rage without warning. It wasn't until Richard's arrest in 1986 that the family's world came crashing down. While out for breakfast, police surrounded their car and arrested Richard for murder. Barbara was shocked but not surprised. She never suspected the full extent of his crimes but had long suspected something was off. After his conviction, she divorced him in 1993, but continued to visit him in prison once a year until his death. Richard's children, deeply affected by the trauma of living with him, made sure to distance themselves from his dark legacy. Merrick, the oldest daughter, chose to work in the media and raised her family far from the spotlight. Despite the pain they endured, they've tried to protect their own families from similar harm. Richard Kuklinski's criminal life started in the early 1970s when he joined the mafia, particularly the Gambino crime family. His first connection to the mafia was through Roy DeMeo, a well-known hitman. Roy quickly noticed that Richard had no emotions when it came to killing. This ability to kill without hesitation made him a good fit for the mafia. Soon, he became one of the most feared contract killers, and it is believed he was responsible for over 200 murders. Richard's methods of killing were violent and creative. One of the most famous ways he killed was by using cyanide. He would mix the poison into food or drinks, which caused a fast and hard-to-trace death. Sometimes he would release cyanide into the air to kill his target. This method helped him avoid being caught by law enforcement. But cyanide wasn't the only method Richard used. He also used guns, knives, crossbows, and sometimes strangulation or blunt force to kill people. Richard was given the nickname the Iceman because he often froze his victims' bodies. Freezing the body made it difficult for the police to determine when the person had died. It also made it hard to identify the victim, especially if the body was left in a remote place and frozen for a long time. One of his most famous murders involved a man named Louis Masgay, whose body was frozen for over 2 years before it was found. Freezing the bodies made Richard almost impossible to catch, as it made the deaths harder to solve. Because of his cold and careful way of killing, Richard became a highly valued hitman. He worked for many criminal groups and charged a lot of money for his services. His skill at taking out rivals or anyone who posed a threat to the mafia made him a useful person to know. But Richard didn't just kill for the mafia. He also killed people on his own if they upset him or crossed him. His total lack of guilt and willingness to kill over small things made him a very dangerous person. In 1986, however, Richard's criminal activities came to an end. The FBI caught him after an undercover investigation recorded him talking about a murder-for-hire plan. He was arrested and charged with multiple murders. Inside sources from the criminal world gave information that helped the police gather enough evidence to convict him. Richard Kuklinski was sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole. Richard's connection to the mafia and his brutal way of killing made him one of the most well-known hitmen in America. What made his story even more shocking was that he hid his true self. On the outside, he was a loving family man, but behind closed doors, he was a killer. His ability to lead a double life shows how some people can hide their dark side while appearing normal to others. His story makes us think about how easily someone can hide who they really are. His connection to the mafia, his brutal ways of killing, and his ability to stay hidden for so long make his story one of the most terrifying examples of someone living a double life. Richard Kuklinski's life as a family man hid the dark truth of his violent career as one of the most feared contract killers. He managed to keep this secret for many years, allowing him to continue his deadly work. His public image was carefully built, and his ability to separate his home life from his criminal life helped him avoid being caught for decades. The brutal nature of his crimes made his double life even more terrifying. At home, Richard was a loving husband and father. He worked hard to support his family, attended his children's activities, and was present in their lives. He played the role of the caring family man so well that his wife, Barbara, never suspected him of being involved in violent work. When he left for what he called business trips, Barbara believed he was simply working. In reality, these trips were for murder. He would not explain where he was going or how long he would be gone, and Barbara never questioned him. His ability to keep up this act for so long showed how manipulative he was. What made Richard especially dangerous was his skill at deceiving people. He convinced his wife and children that he was just an ordinary man with a regular job. He kept his violent world completely separate from his family life, so they had no idea about the murders he committed. When he returned home from his business trips, there were no signs that anything was wrong. In fact, he often bought his family gifts, reinforcing the image of a perfect father and husband. His ability to blend into family life while secretly committing such brutal crimes made him one of the most terrifying criminals. Psychologists who studied him noted that he had a disturbing lack of emotional connection to human life. He talked about his murders in a calm and detached way, showing no sign of guilt. His emotional coldness made him especially dangerous because he didn't feel bad about taking a life. To him, killing wasn't wrong, it was just a job. He saw people as either threats or targets to be removed for business purposes. Richard's lack of remorse wasn't limited to his personal thoughts. It showed in how he interacted with other criminals as well. He was known for being cold and hard to approach. He had a quick temper, but would only show it when someone crossed him or posed a threat. He was careful, calculating, and distrustful of everyone. His suspicion and paranoia kept him alive in the dangerous world of organized crime. He never trusted anyone completely, which protected him from the betrayals common in criminal circles. Richard's ability to keep his two lives separate likely came from his difficult childhood. He grew up in a violent and abusive home, which could have caused him to lose the ability to feel empathy. The abuse he faced as a child left him emotionally scarred and unable to form healthy human connections. This emotional disconnection made it easier for him to commit murder without feeling the emotions that might affect others. Richard's reputation in the mafia was built on his efficiency and lack of emotion. He didn't kill because of anger or passion. He killed because it was his job. He worked with several mafia families, including the famous Gambino family. Through his connection with crime boss Roy DeMeo, Richard learned the skills of a contract killer. Roy's violent ways greatly influenced Richard's career. Under Roy DeMeo's guidance, Richard learned to kill without any emotional involvement, and that became his trademark. The methods Richard used to carry out his murders were just as chilling as the murders themselves. He often used poison, such as cyanide, but also used guns and knives. His murders were carefully planned, leaving little evidence behind. Richard treated murder like a job that needed to be done, with no emotion involved. He was unpredictable and used whatever tools were available at the moment. One of his most infamous techniques was how he disposed of bodies. He often left bodies in remote places and let them decompose for weeks, making it hard for police to solve the crime. Despite his careful planning, Richard's criminal activities eventually caught up with him. In 1986, an undercover investigation led to his arrest for his role in a murder-for-hire scheme. His trial revealed the full extent of his crimes, and he was convicted of several murders. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he continued to show no remorse for his actions. In the 1990s, Richard gave several interviews, including one for HBO's The Iceman tapes. In these interviews, he spoke about his murders in a calm and collected way. He showed no signs of guilt or regret when discussing his crimes. Experts who studied his case described him as a psychopath, believing that his lack of emotional connection to his victims made it easy for him to commit such violent acts. His ability to talk about his murders without any emotional response made him even more frightening. Richard Kuklinski's life as a family man, his cold detachment from his murders, and his ability to deceive those closest to him made him one of the most terrifying criminals ever. His story shows how someone can hide their true nature and live a double life while committing horrible acts of violence. Richard's traumatic childhood, combined with his work in organized crime, shaped him into a man with no conscience, no remorse, and no empathy. His ability to separate his personal life from his criminal activities allowed him to live among normal people, while secretly carrying out his brutal work. In the 1980s, law enforcement started suspecting that Richard Kuklinski was involved in a series of murders. However, they did not have enough solid proof to connect him directly to the crimes. At that time, Kuklinski was a feared hitman in the mafia. He was well known for his skill in killing and his ability to cover up his tracks. One of the methods he often used was cyanide, a deadly poison. He would also freeze his victims' bodies, which made it very hard for investigators to determine when they had died. This complicated their work and made it difficult to uncover the truth. In 1986, the authorities decided to take action. They set up an undercover operation with the goal of getting real evidence of Kuklinski's crimes. Their plan was to buy cyanide from him, which he had used in several of his murders. The agents needed to earn his trust, follow his movements, and gather enough evidence to make an arrest. While the police knew he was involved in organized crime, they needed concrete proof before they could take any action. On December 17, 1986, their plan finally worked. Richard was caught selling cyanide to undercover agents. This was a huge breakthrough in the case. The transaction was recorded, providing enough evidence to charge him with several crimes, including multiple murders. This event marked a major turning point in the investigation and allowed authorities to proceed with the case. While Richard's arrest was a big success for law enforcement, the investigation did not stop there. The authorities continued to collect more evidence, including Richard's confessions. During his trial, he was charged with 5 murders. However, experts believed that he had killed many more people than that. Richard himself claimed that he had murdered over 200 people, but some of these statements were likely exaggerated or made to appear more dramatic. In 1988, during his trial, prosecutors presented a chilling account of Richard's violent career. They played recordings of his confessions, where he admitted to several murders. Throughout these recordings, Richard sounded calm and emotionless. He showed no sign of guilt or regret. His cold and detached attitude confirmed that he had no empathy for his victims. Experts later concluded that Richard was a psychopath, which meant that he lacked any emotional connection to the terrible things he did. Richard's trial was a significant moment in the battle against organized crime. It shed light on how the mafia operated in a world filled with violence and murder. Despite his public image as a loving husband and father, The court heard disturbing details about his crimes. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction ended his criminal activities and gave some sense of justice to the families of his victims. After his arrest and conviction, Richard Kuklinski's story continued to interest the public. He gave several interviews while in prison, including one with HBO, where he discussed his life as a hitman. His calm and emotionless way of talking about the murders he committed shocked viewers. He seemed completely indifferent, showing no remorse. His ability to speak about his violent past without feeling anything made him an even more frightening figure. Psychologists who studied Richard concluded that he was a classic example of a psychopath. He lacked empathy and guilt. His ability to separate his life as a family man from his life as a cold-blooded killer allowed him to live a double life. On one hand, he was a husband and father who took care of his family. On the other hand, he was a brutal killer, willing to take lives without thinking twice. This ability to hide his true nature from those around him helped him avoid detection for so many years. Richard's capture was not only the end of his criminal activities, but it also highlighted the dangers of people who can hide their true nature from the world. His case serves as a reminder that some of the most dangerous criminals are able to blend into society, all while secretly committing horrific crimes. Even after his arrest, Richard Kuklinski's story continued to fascinate people. His ability to deceive everyone, including his own family, and his cold indifference to the lives he took made him one of the most notorious figures in the history of organized crime. His arrest, along with his interviews and the investigation into his criminal activities, provided valuable insights into the mind of a psychopath. His case has since become an important example in both criminal psychology and law enforcement. The lessons learned from his actions continue to influence how law enforcement approaches organized crime and the investigation of violent criminals. Richard Kuklinski's legacy is full of pain and betrayal, both for his family and the people who followed his story. He was able to hide the truth about his violent life, pretending to be a loving family man while secretly being a dangerous hitman. This double life caused great harm to his family and became something the public was both shocked and fascinated by. His wife, Barbara, described their marriage as a nightmare. Although Kuklinski acted like a caring husband and father, he was really abusive and controlling. When he was kind, she would call him Good Richie, but when his temper flared, she called him Bad Richie. His outbursts were terrifying, and he used threats to keep Barbara and the children under control. Barbara didn't stay with him because of love, but because she was afraid for her life and the safety of her kids. Richard's violent behavior also affected his children. Although they were not physically hurt, the emotional damage was significant. His daughter, Merrick, admitted that she loved her father, but also feared him. Finding out about his secret life as a killer was a huge shock that left deep scars. After Richard's arrest in 1986, Barbara divorced him and began working on rebuilding her life. She tried to protect her children from the media attention that came after his capture and the stories about his crimes. But the damage done to their family was not easy to heal. Merrick, while grateful for therapy, stayed out of the public eye. The rest of Richard's children also chose to live private lives away from the media. The shame and emotional pain they carried from knowing who their father really was left permanent scars on their lives. When Richard was arrested, his story quickly became a public sensation. Documentaries like The Iceman Tapes and the 2012 movie The Iceman brought his chilling confessions to a larger audience. In interviews and films, Richard talked openly about his murders in a calm and emotionless way. His ability to speak about his violent crimes without any remorse shocked and disturbed viewers. He even claimed to have killed over 100 people, though many questioned if that number was true. The contrast between his role as a family man and his cold-blooded actions as a killer made his story even more fascinating to the public. Richard's case shows the deep psychological complexity of people who live double lives. His ability to appear normal while committing terrible acts of violence shows how dangerous some people can be, even when they blend in with everyday society. His story also makes us wonder how someone can become so detached from the harm they cause, to the point where they don't feel anything about it. For Richard's family, however, his legacy is one of lasting pain. The public's fascination with his life has only made their suffering worse. Beneath the crimes he committed, there is a family that was broken apart by his violence, control, and secrecy. Richard's story is a reminder that some of the most dangerous people can hide in plain sight, and even the people closest to them may never truly know who they are. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, then please click on one of the videos on your screen now. If you have a topic suggestion, please send it to the email in the description. And as always, remember to like, comment, share the video, and subscribe to our channel. And remember, the only thing scarier than this story is missing out on our next video.